It caused a great stir and consternation both in the White House, the State Department, and the Defense Department. It was decided that we would take whatever legal action we could to prohibit it.
Nobody in the White House has actually seen the study. There did not seem to be any warnings coming from either the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, or the State Department on Sunday or even early Monday morning that any of these branches of the executive branch were concerned that publication would really injure national security.
I know I talked to Rogers, I talked to Laird, that discovered that in the Pentagon Papers there were materials that would jeopardize the American government's relationship with other governments. And that was the crux of it, as I recall, as to why we proceeded to take action to try and stop the publications.
In the White House, President Nixon, sometime between Sunday morning and Monday morning, had a change of mind. And so on Monday morning, he tells Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, to make an investigation of the leaker, and by this time they thought it was Daniel Ellsberg, and to commence criminal investigations of the New York Times. There's no mention of a prior restraint at this moment. They only knew that the documents were labeled top secret, but that was enough for them to say, if I have to make a judgment here based upon what little I know, I'm going to decide that the publication of these documents will injure national security as opposed to reaching the opposite conclusion.
William Rehnquist is working at the Justice Department at that point. He's not in the Supreme Court. What's his role?
The pressure from the Justice Department comes from Robert Mardian, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Internal Security. He tried to learn what he could about the study and to figure out whether or not the Justice Department should be recommending some kind of legal action against the Times. It was in that context that Attorney General John Mitchell asked Assistant Attorney General William Rehnquist, before he goes on the court, to give him an opinion as to the possibility of the government prevailing against the Times if the government brought a lawsuit seeking a prior restraint against the newspaper.
I was asked to kind of assume the worst. You come back with a very hypothetical statement that if it was stuff like what they talked about in New York against Minnesota, very likely it could be enjoined. I'd never seen the Pentagon Papers. All you could tell them was that by language in New York against Minnesota, this kind of thing was accepted from the general prohibition against prior restraint. And therefore, if the Pentagon Papers contained this sort of thing, maybe a prior restraint could be justified.
In your book, you talk about how Secretary McNamara said to you that he commissioned the Pentagon Papers so that future historians and national security experts would learn from mistakes, and including his own.
No, I think he was really tormented by his decisions, which helped lead us into the war right up to our eyeballs. And then he was tormented by his own conclusions that this was not a winnable war. There were concerns in Washington circulating at the time that he was so tormented by and conflicted about the war and felt so hogtied in terms of what he could actually do to relieve the situation that people were worried really about his stability and his health.
And I was doing it for purposes of history and not having to do with decisions that would be made at the time. I suspect I wanted to get it done and have it packaged in the files of the department before I left, for fear it wouldn't be completed.
Daniel Ellsberg is an insider who really has a conversion.
In a nutshell, you have with Daniel Ellsberg an individual who is very committed to the military endeavor in Vietnam in the early 60s and was in the Marines and was, I think, a strong advocate of what the United States was trying to do in South Asia at the time. And then sometime around 65 and 6, things began to really switch. And there came a time where he really just leaned over in the other direction. And he became convinced that if others had the chance to read the entire study the way he had, they too would be as committed to his position, which was against the military intervention by the United States in Vietnam, as he was.
How does this all differ from WikiLeaks?
Neither one of these individuals have anything like a career of Daniel Ellsberg, who was a gifted man and with an astounding kind of career in the Pentagon, being part of the decision-making operation, working very close to people who were really at the center of power for a long period of time. The individuals in the WikiLeaks story have no similarity whatsoever to this.
All right, Les, Gelb, I think you're in trouble again because he tells me he wants to jump in here. What is it?
Matter of the historical record. There was a copy of the full set of the Pentagon Papers in the White House. Henry Kissinger had it. We sent it to him. I brought it over to him. And Kissinger had actually read the diplomatic volumes, but nothing else. But he had Al Haig as one of his deputies. And Al Haig was quite familiar with the history of the Pentagon Papers. In fact, we tried to get him to work on one of the studies, but he was smart enough to say no. Then he was in Kissinger's office, and he was the one, more than anyone else, who rattled Kissinger and other people in the White House about the papers really harming national security. Now, just one more point about Daniel Ellsberg, who's a key figure in this story, much as that soldier is in the WikiLeaks story. It's very important to understand that Dan Ellsberg was a hawk. Until 1965, he was a hawk. And then he did change, as many people changed more gradually. But it goes to my point that Ellsberg, my good friend David Halberstam, the people who worked in the Pentagon, the State Department, you name it, it was ingrained in the foreign policy community that there was really a domino theory and that the test of wills was taking place in Vietnam. Ellsberg believed it for many years and then stopped believing it and then refused to believe he ever believed it again. And it's very important to understand because these papers are taken as a history of lying when they're actually much, much less than that.
Does it matter the motives of the leaker? Does it matter that he was a hawk and then he wasn't? Or
It doesn't.
I agree with Les. No, it doesn't matter. The material matters. If for the worst motive in the world, someone gives you valuable, newsworthy, accurate information that allows citizens in a democracy to know what the government is doing in their name, that I don't care if it's Genghis Khan giving it to me. You don't take the source's word for or interpretation of the documents, but if they're documentary materials from the government and complete, and you can authenticate them and put them in context, the source's motives in that setting ought matter not at all.
and explain a little bit more about the culture of leaks, because that is behind all this, right? I mean, there are leaks and then there are leaks.
The culture of leaks. Well, what reporters like to say is that, it's not like we sit by the phone and wait for the confidential source to call us. I mean, you do try to, plow the ground, make sure that connect the dots, shake the tree, use your metaphors. You pick up information when you can. The Pentagon Papers or a WikiLeaks type document dump are really the exception.
You started earlier to talk about your role in looking at leaks. Do you distinguish leaks, some leaks from other leaks, top secret, classified, what the motive is of the leaker?
Well, there really are differences amongst leaks. I mean, maybe this is the chance for me to say something about WikiLeaks,
Sure.
which is, I think there really is an enormous difference between the Pentagon Papers and the WikiLeaks, and we're sort of setting this up a little bit to suggest this is one sort of continuum, and WikiLeaks is just the same. But let me sort of suggest this to you. I mean, the different factors, we've got 250,000 State Department cables having to do with State Department operations in 190 countries around the world, current operations, current reports of exactly what the State Department is talking to, and there's not any suggestion of actually governmental wrongdoing here. I don't think anybody, I'm not saying in 250,000 cables you're not going to find the government hasn't done something wrong, but basically it's just showing the Foreign Service going about doing its work and collecting information from human rights activists, from political dissidents, from lower-ranking officials in government, the sorts of things that if you expose publicly, this is different than the history of the Vietnam War, looking backwards. This is stuff that the Foreign Service is trying to do on a daily basis to collect information, in fact, to promote freedom of expression, rule of law, human rights, and if you collect all of this information that the State Department is doing on a daily basis, just simply disgorge it all as the department is doing its work, I would say that is much different than a retroactive history of the Vietnam War sure, it may have some current impact, but it's basically looking back 30 years in one country, and where, in fact, there is an argument that the government was lying to the American people and that it was important to show what was being done here.
One of the big questions in WikiLeaks is the definition of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. Is he a journalist? Is he a publisher? Is WikiLeaks a media organization? How much does that matter, and who determines?
Yes, yes, no, no. No, I don't think he's a journalist. No, I don't think it matters. He's either entitled to First Amendment protection or he's not, and I don't think it will or should change because of the definition of journalist.
He gets, I mean, whether he's got First Amendment protection or not is great stuff for the classroom. It doesn't protect him against a criminal prosecution under the Espionage Act. If he knew or had reason to know that that information could be used by enemies of the United States to harm the national security of the United States, and apparently he had every reason to know that. In fact, that's why he released it, that he's prosecutable. That much will get him 10 years. If anybody dies as a result, that much gets him the death penalty.
Yeah, let me just add one other thing. I think it is an open question what the Espionage Act does or does not cover on its face. But the fact of the matter is, to the best of my knowledge, other than the prosecution of the AIPAC lobbyists, the Espionage Act has never been used to prosecute anybody other than a government employee who releases information to the enemy. And that's because I think there is, in fact, a very, very serious constitutional question about whether the statute could be applied under those circumstances.
Do we need new leak laws, which is something that I can tell you we do discuss a lot in every agency that I've been at. I was at the Justice Department before I went to the White House, before I went to the State Department. And the CIA says exactly what Floyd says is, gee, there are all these leaks. We never seem to be able to prosecute anyone ever. These old 1917 espionage statutes don't do us any good. Let's just have a nice, clean law that says it shall be a crime to intentionally disclose classified information. And in fact, when I was at the Justice Department in 1999, that support for that crescendoed to the point that Congress, in fact, passed a very simple leak statute that said just that one line, so we didn't have to prosecute people under old espionage statutes. And interestingly, it was then vetoed by President Clinton, saying, who I think was largely under pressure from newspapers and civil liberties groups, saying, well, but it's difficult to tell what's classified information and so forth. And since that time, this cycles back. Every time there's a new leak, about every 2 or 3 years, the intelligence agencies and various members of Congress will then press to have a new leak statute, and it happened again after WikiLeaks. So we'll probably see that effort to have new leak legislation.